Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
If I could see Allison, but Allison's behind Ashley.
Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Wow. Why doesn't this happen like any other time I'm with all of you? All right, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm Tom Schreier, and I have the great privilege of being the founding director of the Inspired Leadership Initiative, our program here at the University of Notre Dame, where people come after having finished their traditional career to discover, discern, and then design the next act in their life. And I want to heartily welcome both our in-person audience here as well as our live stream audience and those of you that listen to us asynchronously after for the next installment of Inspiring Conversations. Lately, what we've been talking about is leadership in public conversation. And we've heard from leaders across various disciplines and industries that really are leaders and really do drive public conversations, sometimes in more specific areas and sometimes more broadly. Today's session, as those of you who are on the live stream know, is being live streamed on our online learning community, ThinkND. And I want to thank everybody, particularly the Alumni Association, who's just done a remarkable job in terms of building the audience for ThinkND and really initially bringing it into existence. So today, I'm thrilled, Brian, to introduce you. Brian Rosenberg is going to discuss with us navigating change in institutions of higher education, or at least maybe better titled, attempting to navigate change in institutions of higher education. Brian currently serves as a visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he's also a senior advisor to the African Leadership University. Previously, Brian served as the 16th president of Macalester College in Minnesota for 17 years. And he's also recently the author of the book, a title I love, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, Resistance to Change in Higher Education, as well as several articles that have been published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and many other publications, I'm quite sure. So welcome.
It's a privilege. Thank you, Tom.
So let me start with one of my favorite lines in your book, and that is, you cannot read the label when you are inside the bottle. I sense perhaps you perceived some of the situation that you wrote about. That is, if you weren't too oxygen deprived inside the bottle while you were in your position. But maybe just share with us a little bit, how many of the insights kind of came forth more upon reflection and after having left the position of president at Macalester?
Well, first I have to give credit for that wonderful aphorism to Atlanta Thwala, who's the provost at the African Leadership University. And when he said it, it really resonated with me. I think the reality is that most of the things that I write about in the book are things that gradually accumulated themselves in my brain as I was moving through a long career as a faculty member and as a dean and then as a college president. But for a whole variety of reasons, I think you repress them. Some of it is simple self-preservation. And a lot of it is the fact that, particularly when you're a college president, your job is to be a cheerleader for your institution and for your industry. Right. And college presidents don't survive very long if they go around talking about all the things that are wrong. And my first responsibility was to be as good a president of Macalester College as I could be. Right. But I was not unaware of the things that I wrote about. But having the opportunity to step away and do two things in particular. One is to teach about higher education, and therefore look at it really as a scholar and as a critic. And the other is to work outside an American context. Right. Really crystallized for me some of the things that were banging around in my brain and that I recognized as impediments to change in an industry that I think at this point needs it.
Right. So talk a little bit about then what catalyzed, and you mentioned this in our discussion yesterday, but what catalyzed the decision to actually sit down and write about this?
You know, as hard as I think it may be for some people to believe, since sometimes the book is perceived as very critical, it really is born out of a love for and a belief in the importance of higher education. And my own sense that we are at a point where, unless things in fact do change in more than incremental ways, higher education is simply not going to be able to fulfill its social mission. Right. And I know that people have been saying that about higher education since the moment higher education was created. Right. And it is tempting to just see this as the boy crying wolf. Right. But every once in a while there's a wolf. Right. And I've become increasingly convinced that this is, certainly in my career, a unique moment for higher education. And unless change happens, we're going to see a lot of institutions close, and we're going to see a lot of people in this country and around the world underserved. And so I set out to try to understand why change is so hard, and to get beyond simply pointing fingers at individuals and try to understand the customs and the structures that make change so difficult. When a phenomenon is this widespread, you can't simply attribute it to bad actors. Right. So I tend to look at structures and cultures, and that's what I tried to understand. You can't get out of a hole unless you acknowledge you're in a hole. Right. And why you're in a hole. And so that's what I wanted to do in the book.
So I kind of think about this on two dimensions, right? One is there something about the last 10, 15, 20 years that is different, and if so, what? And then, what would you, then to get to, the heart of the book, which is, what would you prescribe? What is it that you would prescribe? So, either or both.
So first of all, the differences. Number one is simply cost. If you look at the cost curve of higher education, it pretty much looks like this. If you want to find a comparable cost curve, actually, you need to look at dentistry. And the cost curves look the same for the same reason. It's a phenomenon that economists sometimes call cost disease. So you have increased cost but not increased productivity. And so year after year after year, the cost of higher education goes up more rapidly than the inflation rate or the cost of living index, and certainly goes up more rapidly than the ability of most people to pay for it. And every time we cross another barrier, we crossed the $30,000 barrier, and people said, that's impossible, then 40, then 50. Some schools have now crossed $80,000. And if you just do the math, 10 years from now, it's going to cost you a couple $100,000 a year to send your child to a selective private college, unless something changes. And that has overlapped with, as we all know, growing income inequality and a shrinking middle class. So you simply have fewer people who can afford to and are willing to pay the cost of higher education, and higher education has been unable to bend that cost curve. Then you add demographics, and we are an aging nation. The median age in the United States now is 38. And we are facing what demographers are referring to as a demographic cliff in the second half of this decade, when the number of high school graduates in the United States is going to drop by 15%. And that is the audience for most traditional colleges and universities. So take whatever enrollment challenges colleges are facing now and subtract 15% of the students. And you can imagine what kind of pressure that's going to create. And then the third factor is technology. I think that the technological revolution over the last 15 or 20 years has changed almost every industry. Higher education has been one of the slowest to change, but I also think that will not continue to be the case. I think technology will be more disruptive to traditional higher education over the next 10 years than it has ever been before in its history. So I think when you combine costs, demographics, and technology, you might want to throw in as a fourth factor the declining public confidence in higher education. It feels to me very much like a different moment.
Yeah, I mean, that was where I was going to go a little bit here, is you have the cost moving this direction, but I do also have the sense that the perceived value is also moving in a different direction. We talked about this a little bit in the context of student loans earlier, so maybe just to kind of flesh that out a little bit, right, in terms of, the statistics may point one direction, but the perception another.
Yeah, now it remains the case, and I am emphatic about this point, that for most people, money spent on higher education is the best money you can spend. The return on your investment when you spend or borrow for higher education is better than for almost anything you can spend money on. But it is becoming more and more difficult to make that claim as the costs go up. And so what we are beginning to see beyond simply polls that say that people don't have confidence in higher education are employers beginning to say, we no longer require a bachelor's degree.
Right.
In Minnesota, your current state, my former state, there was just a decision made that the vast majority of jobs with the state will no longer require a bachelor's degree. The same decision was made in Massachusetts and has been made in a number of states. Just try to imagine the impact on higher education if more and more employers say, you know what, the bachelor's degree is no longer the golden ticket. We're looking for a particular set of skills that we can either provide ourselves or you can get elsewhere. What is sustaining higher education as an industry right now, despite its cost, is the accurate sense that it is the entryway into a whole different set of career paths. But it is very possible that that's changing. And if that changes in a major way, then that may have a more profound effect on higher education than any of the other factors that I mentioned up until now. So it's not just public opinion polls, right. It's decisions that employers are making.
Yeah, and maybe it should be lost on me, but it's not that. It's interesting that a state employer that also happens to be a major funder of a state institution, university, makes that decision, right? I mean, it seems to me that maybe there's a little bit of the left hand not speaking with the right hand.
Part of the reality, and this is certainly true in Minnesota and Massachusetts, is that given demographics, there aren't enough people with bachelor's degrees to fuel a knowledge-based economy. Right. And so these states have to look to other solutions because higher education isn't producing enough people with those degrees as the population becomes more diverse. And so simply in order to fill these jobs, they have to look to alternative pathways. And so it's an acknowledgement that higher education isn't producing enough people to meet the demands of the workforce.
So you've talked now a little bit about the kind of why we find ourselves in this situation, maybe more acutely than ever. The what? What would you prescribe in terms of the kinds of change that need to overcome resistance?
So I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I would be a terrible physician because I'm much better at diagnosing than I am at prescribing a cure.
And you have a few doctors in the audience here, so you got to be careful.
So I am not a futurist and don't have the magic bullet. But I would begin by looking at ways to bend that cost curve. You simply have to find a way to make higher education less expensive. 2/3 of the budget of virtually every college and university in the country is made up of personnel costs. And so you're going to have to find a way to reach more students with fewer people. And to do it in a way that's effective. And to take advantage, I think, of two fundamental things that higher education is underused. One is technology, and one can only guess at how artificial intelligence is going to affect the work of higher education. But the other is sort of the inverse, and that's human beings, experiential learning. Now, colleges have tended to wall themselves off from the communities that surround them. When the reality is there's a lot of knowledge out there. And there are a lot of people who are willing to share that knowledge with young people. And so one of the ways at the African Leadership University that we've lowered the tuition to $3,000 a year is by relying very heavily on experiential learning. Having students do internships, having students work side by side with people who are doing the jobs that they might want someday. And it's kind of a win-win because these people are getting essentially free, smart, young people to work with them. Right. The students are learning a lot. They're getting credit toward a degree. And it's costing the institution a lot less. So I would, it seems like almost two polar opposites, but both technology and what it can do and the human capacity to learn through doing. Those two things, I think, can have the potential to change the cost. And I think I'd like to see institutions explore both of those directions much more seriously.
So one of the things that would seem to me is critical to facilitate change is having great leadership in universities. And we seem to be also at a moment where being a president or a senior leader in a university is particularly challenging. And that would cause me even greater concern that these kind of changes can happen. Do you agree with my premise that it is more challenging? And how do you think that plays out?
The data support your premise. When I became president at Macalester in the fall of 2003, the average presidential tenure was 8 or 9 years. It's now fallen to under 6, and at public institutions it's closer to 5. So presidents aren't lasting as long. I think there are a number of reasons for it. I had the good fortune to become a president when there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, and social media has affected virtually every area of our lives, and it certainly made the job of any leader, and certainly college presidents, more difficult. In the old days, all I would get was angry emails. Now you get somebody who's angry at you on Twitter, and an hour later there are 5,000 people who are angry at you. The other factor is, and I think we all know this, we're living in a moment where we don't tend to extend people a lot of grace. We are not very good at tolerating human frailty. And so people make one mistake, and somebody is calling for their head. And nobody's perfect, and every president, particularly newer presidents, are going to make some mistakes. And for reasons that I am unprepared to explain, I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, we seem to have gotten much worse as a society in allowing for those kinds of mistakes in our leaders. So it has become a more challenging and difficult job, and I think it's a problem. Because I think you do need both good leadership and leadership that has some breathing room and some time. I think it's very hard for a president to have an impact in 3 or 4 years.
Well, you had talked about how one of the criteria when a presidential search is underway is that person is a change agent. But then at the same time, your view that it's most challenging to be a change agent as president at the beginning of their tenure. So this kind of shortening of tenure and need for change just seem to be diametrically opposed.
Yeah, I think institutions tend to have it backward. If you do look at job ads for presidents, every single one, for the most part, other than at the most elite institutions, will talk about wanting to hire someone who's transformational, someone who's a change agent. The reality is, the new president is in the worst position to change an institution in dramatic ways. It is a president who's been around for a while, who's built up some political capital, who's built up some trust, and honestly has less to lose. Those are the people who are really in a position to push for more dramatic change. And so to put the weight of change on the shoulders of a brand new president who is simply trying to build up trust in the community, learn the culture of an institution, seems to me backwards. And so I think we often place unrealistic expectations on new presidents. I have friends who are new presidents who are told by the boards that they are hired by, you have to do this, this, and this. They come in and they do this, this, and this. The community revolts, and the board suddenly vanishes. And so that's not a good way to run an institution.
No. So you've had the opportunity in the time since the book was published to be at a number of institutions like you've graced us with your presence here. What have you learned from that process? I'd imagine there's some things that you weren't aware of that you're now aware of as a result of the time you spent.
What I've learned is that many of the things that I said out loud in the book, people have been saying quietly to themselves for a long time. And I think that to a greater extent than I expected, the book has struck a chord.
Good.
with people. So I have had the opportunity to talk to and continue to talk to boards and leadership teams. And generally the response I'm getting is, you're saying exactly what we're seeing. Right. And you said out loud exactly what we've been thinking, which is encouraging in the sense that I think there is a growing awareness within higher education that the status quo is not sustainable. At Notre Dame, it's sustainable. And we could talk about elite institutions. They're in a different place, right, in a different category.
And you write about that as well.
But at 95, 98% of institutions in the United States, the status quo is really not sustainable. And it is encouraging to see that there are actually a fair number of people who recognize that and are looking for ways to do something more than tinker around the edges.
So it sounds like that there's some positive sense in you, that there's an appreciation. Do you think there's a courage to act, especially at those institutions that need to act in order to survive?
There's, at the entryway of both campuses of the African Leadership University, there are 3 words painted on the wall. And it's a saying that, that the founder, Fred Swaniker, who's a Macalester graduate, is fond of using, and it is do hard things. And his argument has always been that those of us who are in positions of privilege have the responsibility not to do easy things, but to do hard things. And not hard things that benefit ourselves, but hard things that benefit others. And so I do think there are people out there with that courage. I don't deny the fact that it is really difficult. Right. And I don't deny the fact that you're not always going to succeed. But if you're a trustee of a college, if you're a president of a college, in my view, that's what you sign up for. Right. The job of a college president is not to keep the job of a college president. Right. The job of a college president is to serve and advance the mission of your institution. And sometimes that means doing really hard things. Is that something that everybody is going to do? No. But I know enough people and have been inspired by enough people to believe that there are people on every campus, administrators and faculty and staff, who understand the need for change, and that some of them will do hard things.
So rightly or wrongly, I think institutions of higher education get accused of being somewhat insular, right, and kind of just being on in their own island. And one of the things I appreciated about you from when we first met, which was in the context of a healthcare board, is that I think that you can learn from seeing other industries that might be facing similar challenges, right, and hearing what those leaders are doing and what's happening. Do other people in positions like you had at Macalester, or more broadly, step out of the envelope and work to learn from other industries that might, provide some lessons that can be beneficial in helping their institution and their industry?
Not enough, I think.
Okay.
I personally found that serving for 10 years on the board of a large nonprofit healthcare system was enormously beneficial to my understanding of some of the challenges in my own industry. Because the reality is that nonprofit healthcare and nonprofit higher education have a lot of the same challenges.
Right.
We have faculty, they have primary care and other providers, and I say that as someone whose wife was a primary care physician. But both groups are difficult to move. And so it really helped me to see another industry dealing with some of the same kinds of challenges and understand what problems were systemic, what problems were unique to my institution. So I think higher education, by and large, has been too insular. Yeah. And typically when people come on the boards of colleges from other industries, their views are at least often dismissed by people saying, well, you don't understand higher education. Right. It's different here. Right. And it is different.
It is.
But that doesn't mean that that different industry can't learn something from other industries that operate in a different way. I don't think a college or university is ever going to operate like a publicly traded for-profit company.
Right.
But there are things that you can learn from looking at those organizations, like everybody being aligned in working toward the mission.
Right.
You know, one of the things you find at colleges and universities is that people can't even agree on what the mission is.
Right.
There are some organizations in other industries that have been really good about that, and that's been very effective.
Right. Well, that's why I say I admired that with you, because my experience is that great leaders actually find solutions oftentimes well outside of the discipline, and they oftentimes, you know, when they hear themselves say we're different, they might realize that that might be part of the problem, is that as opposed to acknowledging that there are similarities and learnings, that they don't, and then they just find themselves in an even worse position. So shifting gears just a little bit, your thoughts on what institutions like a Notre Dame or a Harvard or you know, somebody who's in, what responsibilities do institutions like ours here and other similar institutions have in helping to facilitate the thriving of higher education, which you know, if you're here, you hopefully believe that it's a really, really important part of the social fabric.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, on the one hand, institutions like this and like a small group of similar institutions, a very small group, don't have to change. They're not facing existential questions. For the foreseeable future, they'll continue to enroll students and have the resources that they need. Doesn't mean they shouldn't change. It doesn't mean that they can't find ways to serve their students better. But the truth is they don't need to change. The brand is strong enough. But one can't underestimate the signaling power of the actions of major institutions like this. People notice. They notice the good and the bad. I'm at Harvard. And there was one day a couple of months ago when there were 5 op-eds about Harvard in the same day in the New York Times, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. One institution with 25,000 students, 5 op-eds. There are 8 million students in community colleges, and this is what we're spending our time on. But it is what it is. People pay attention to prestige. And so what I would like to see institutions that have that prestige do is act in ways that are beyond self-interested. I mean, we know that Notre Dame or Harvard or Yale can build another beautiful building. We know that they can hire brilliant faculty, and we know that they can create another cool program. But that's kind of giving more to the same small privileged group of people, you know, to be totally honest. And the rest of the world looks at that and shrugs. And what I would like to see is those institutions do some things that are not in any clear way self-interested. Use some of the enormous resources that they have amassed to do some things that don't simply come back and benefit them through more fundraising or through taking their selectivity from 9% to 7%, but that actually benefit some communities that are really hurting. Find ways to reach out to audiences that are not being served by education, non-traditional audiences. These institutions are powerfully protective of their brands, and their brands are inseparable from selectivity and exclusivity. Higher education may be the only industry that defines excellence in terms of how many people to whom they say no. Just imagine if you went into if you went into a car dealer and they said, congratulations, you're one of 8,000 people who's asked to buy that car, but we only have 200, so sorry. But higher education defines excellence in terms of how many people to whom it says no. It's crazy. And so I'd like to see some of these institutions say yes to more people, even at the and they don't really have to worry about diluting their brand. The brands are strong enough to withstand a little public service. So I would like to see them do more to demonstrate that they take social responsibility really seriously and don't just take seriously their own excellence. We know they're great. We know. We know how many hundreds of millions of dollars they spend on things. But if anything, that's contributing to the public dissatisfaction. When so many people are struggling and then they read about a $300 million gift to Harvard to rename the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Honestly, even most people at Harvard look at that and say, why? Think about what $300 million could do in almost any other context that's not an institution with a $50 billion endowment. More selflessness is what I would like to see, which would be, again, send a powerful signal to other institutions and to society more broadly.
So I'm going to close our Q&A with something. You mentioned cool programs and non-traditional programs. So I'm going to be a little bit parochial and just you've been engaged at Harvard with the fellows that are in their advanced leadership initiative, which is analogous to the Inspired Leadership Initiative here. Just your thoughts on that area of education and kind of how that works from your experience as a former faculty member, university leader, and now faculty member again at Harvard.
Well, first of all, I've loved having them in my classes. They have brought a perspective that it's really hard for even most graduate students to bring. But those participants clearly benefit. But the other thing I've seen is the way they benefit the students, other students in my classes. So it's sort of the beginning of what I was describing, this notion that there are all these smart people out there who are not professors at universities who have a lot to share and a lot to teach. And so, the fellows come in and they learn things, but also a lot of them connect with students. Right. And they provide students with connections outside the institution. Right. So to me, it's a win-win. It's an amazing opportunity at that point in your life to be able to come into a place like this and spend time in a community like this, but it's also a benefit to the students who are in the community to be around people who have a very different level of life experience and sometimes a very different level of practical contacts.
Right. I mean, that was certainly our hope when we launched the program here, is that it wouldn't only be beneficial to our fellows and all the fellows that are here in the audience knows, but also that it'd be beneficial to the institution and the broader community, right? And then ultimately to the broadest of communities as they then, go out and become a force for good, to use our vernacular. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions here, or I know we have the capability to send questions in as well from the live stream, so happy to take those. So, and Papa, I'd just ask you to wait for the microphone, or anybody, because we are being live streamed.
I am Papa. Actually, whether somebody agrees or not, education is a business. If somebody is charging $100,000, I would say it's a price discovery for them, because any business runs in the economic model of price is the intersection of supply demand. So tomorrow, if you charge $150,000, that's your discovery. So when you discover that price, where's the complaint about it, about the cost? For you, it's a cost. For me, it's a price you're charging for your program. So it's market is paying. Why do you worry?
So the reality is that the market is not paying. Right now, the average discount rate at private colleges and universities in the United States is 56%. And I say this in the book, higher education in the US right now is the equivalent of Nordstrom Rack. It is perpetually on sale. And even worse, that discount rate is going up every year. And not by 0.1%, but by 2 or 3%. When I started at Macalester, that median discount rate was down closer to upper 30s or 40. Now it's approaching 60. There are many institutions in which it's 70. So the price that these institutions have set is much higher than consumers are willing to pay. And so what they're having to do in order to fill their seats is to discount it. And that is, to me, the definition of unsustainability. If every year you are marking down your service more and more, it means there is, in fact, a disconnect between your pricing and the market. There is, in fact, a disconnect between supply and demand. If you had enough people who are willing to pay the full sticker price at most colleges, absolutely, it's a supply and demand issue. But I think what we now have right now is a misalignment. And so even when colleges tell you that they've met their enrollment targets, I would encourage, the key number that any college president or CFO looks at is not number of students. The number is net tuition revenue. That is revenue after discounting, after financial aid. And right now that net tuition revenue at most institutions is actually not just inflation adjusted in real dollars, going down. And so that is not a sustainable business model. If there were any other business where every year they had to mark down their products more and more in order to sell them, they would say we're a failing business. There's something wrong here. The market is not willing to pay the price that we are charging. So I think colleges are businesses. They're nonprofit businesses. They need to operate with a positive margin. Most of them are not. The number of private colleges that are operating with structural deficits is very, very high. So the economic model at institutions that are not wealthy and elite is not working. It's broken.
Tim.
Ryan, thank you very much. I read your book, and I have two quick questions. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll have two quick ones. One is, so even at the Wheat University, you talk about they should be weeding, but is anyone willing to give up the structural part of higher education, which is tenure requires postdocs, PhD students, right? You talk about maybe that's weeding versus the students, and it should be the other way around. That's the first question. And second, is anyone in the US going in the right direction? From an experiential learning perspective, I almost look at the trade schools because that's experiential learning and they don't have this superstructure of higher education. So I offer that. Thank you.
So the first question in terms of whether people are willing to really give up some of those, I do talk in the book, higher education has a lot of third rails, which is ironic, things that you're not supposed to talk about in an industry that's supposed to be about exploring all ideas. And there are certain ideas, if you bring them up, you're going to be run out of town. But I do talk about shared governance, and I do talk about tenure. You're not seeing them eliminated, but you're seeing them gradually eroded. So the percentage of faculty who are tenured or on the tenure track is steadily declining. It's now down to maybe 35% of faculty positions nationwide. So tenure is not being summarily eliminated, but I would describe it as being slowly starved. Again, at elite institutions, less so. But you're seeing it most dramatically at regional publics, at small privates that are relying increasingly on underpaid and often overworked adjuncts because they have a lot of faculty who are tenured. There are more tenured faculty in the U.S. who are 65 than there are 35. The average age of a tenured faculty member is 10 years older than the average age of an American worker. And the reason is pretty simple. Why would you retire? Yeah. Why would you retire? If you are physically able to do your job, why would you retire? And so they're not. And so the average age is getting higher and higher and higher. So colleges are finding workarounds because if you try to die on that hill of eliminating tenure, you will die in professional terms. And so it's not being eliminated, but it is shrinking. And I think that's not serving the industry well. In my view, having two classes and one of the things I love, by the way, about Notre Dame, and Tom and I have talked about this, is that you in fact have well-compensated, well-recognized teaching faculty who are not underpaid adjuncts. Yeah. And I think that's a great thing. And it signals the fact that you take undergraduate teaching seriously, but it is not the case at most research universities. So it is, these things are shrinking, but they're not being eliminated. Now, newer institutions, if you look at any institution in the US that was created within the last couple of decades. There aren't a lot, but Olin College of Engineering in Boston is a good example. They don't have tenure. They have multi-year contracts. Faculty are well compensated, but they're not tenured. Any college president, if strapped to a lie detector and asked, if you were starting a college today, would you have tenure? We'll tell you no. Because it just makes it, tenure has its strengths and weaknesses, but in terms of change, tenure is designed to preserve. And if your goal is preservation, tenure is an extraordinarily effective tool. If your need or your goal is change, tenure is not a particularly effective way of doing that. So the second question is, is anybody, sort of moving in the right direction? You are seeing more and more schools talk about experiential learning. It's on more and more websites, which, colleges are really good at that. Whatever the latest thing is, they'll put it on their website. So if it's being global, you'll see everybody's global. If it's experiential learning, you'll see everybody's experiential. I've learned to try to dig beneath the rhetoric and see what they're really doing. And I haven't looked at enough institutions to know, but I do think there are more that are trying to incorporate experiential learning seriously into their opportunities for students, that are requiring internships or offering internships. So I do think when I started as a faculty member, experiential learning was just completely unimportant. And then it came in and it was relegated to the margins. I think it's moving more from the margins to the center. But like most things in higher education, it's a slow process. So there are people who are trying to do it. The most interesting things I've seen have been in some startups. There are, believe it or not, some higher ed startups. And they're fascinating. They're doing things like offering degrees in 3 years, eliminating, they don't have sports teams, they don't have fraternities, they don't have clubs or fancy dining halls. They teach, and they provide a degree in 3 years, and they charge $7,000 a year, and they serve underserved students. The problem is, it takes 5 years to get accredited. And if you can't get accredited, you can't have access to federal Pell Grants and other federal funding. So the system is not designed to accommodate innovation. And so it's really, these people talk to me, and a lot of them have since I wrote my book, and they say, how do we speed this up? And there's no good answer. If I could snap my finger and change a bunch of things, one of them would be the accreditation process. I'm not saying we don't need it, we do, but there should be some space there for experimentation and for innovation. And right now there's very, very little. So it's hard to start a new college, but some really interesting people are trying to do some really interesting things.
Other questions? Tom.
Thank you, Brian. I've not had the chance to read your book. What do you see happening globally with some of these trends?
I actually think that the most interesting innovation in education is coming from the less developed parts of the world. Another favorite saying of Fred Swaniker is constraint drives innovation. And talk about being in a situation of constraint. You start a university in Africa where the median age is 19, not 38, where you have the fastest growing population in the world, where only 9% of the students who graduate from high school have an opportunity to go on to post-secondary education, and where the average middle-class family can afford to pay $2,000 to $3,000 a year for college. And imagine this is an exam question, right? Start a university. But what it forces you to do is to innovate. And we've seen examples of this. We've seen it in medical technology. We've seen that in places like China and India and Africa, where really expensive medical devices were simply unobtainable, we've seen the development of much less expensive versions, which then got imported back into more developed medical systems. So I think what we're going to see and what we're beginning to see are institutions in places like Africa, like Vietnam, like South America, that are looking to offer higher education options that are less expensive but better than a simple online degree, and where they're not impeded by, Harvard has been around since the 17th century. They've had a lot of time to build up barriers. These barriers don't exist. And so on the one hand, you don't have resources, but on the other hand, you have a green field. You don't have impediments. So you can actually build what you want. And the interesting thing to me is that, at ALU, the founder went to Macalester and Stanford, and the current president went to Princeton. They're both African, but they went to school at elite American institutions. Then they went back to Africa, and they said, basically, we don't want to do that. First of all, we can't do that. But second of all, we think there are better ways to do things. So, it's a process that's sometimes called reverse innovation. We always assume that innovation is top-down, that Apple comes up with the latest cool idea, and that's where innovation comes from. But sometimes it's bottom-up. And my feeling about higher education right now is that it's more likely to be bottom-up than top-down, because that's where the constraint is, and that's where the incentives are to come up with new things. So there is a group, there's actually a meeting that's going to take place in June of what are called new global universities. They range from places like Minerva, which are very expensive and selected and well-funded, to very poorly funded startups. But there are people all over the world who are trying different models. And I think some of these will eventually find their way back into the US when they prove to be successful.
So I think we have time for one more question. I see you've got the mic there, Tim. So, yeah.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. Assuming you were a physician writing a prescription to higher education, what would be the most impactful thing to do? And the second part, if we can't turn this around, is the demise going to be a catastrophic cascade of closures or kind of an inexorable drip, drip, drip over a period of time to some of these small institutions?
So let me take the second first because it's easier. I think it's not going to be a cascade. I don't think you're going to see all of a sudden a headline in the paper one day that 35 colleges have closed. I think it's going to be, we've already begun to see an increasing rate of college closures. I think particularly in New England, the Northeast, and the Midwest, where a lot of these small private colleges are located, you're going to see an increasing rate of closures. But one of the things that I have said for a while is that colleges are like zombies. They're really hard to kill. And so I don't think it's going to happen all at once, but I think it's going to be an increasing rate. Look, supply and demand have to be aligned. And with fewer students, there are going to have to be fewer colleges. It's not a fun thing to say. All of these colleges are doing good work, but right now, the truth is there are just too many seats for the students who are choosing to go to college, and we're not doing a very good job of getting the students who are not going to college. So I think it's going to happen gradually, but at an increasing rate. In terms of prescription, number one, don't try to be all things to all people. It is not unusual to find a college with 800 students and 35 different majors. That's insane. You're better off doing a few things really well than trying to do a lot of things and doing them poorly. So I would encourage more colleges, particularly at-risk colleges, to take the risk and narrow their focus. There's one institution that I work with that I've talked to, which has sort of gone all in on being a provider of healthcare professionals, which they're sorely needed. And so they've kind of shifted from a liberal arts focus to a healthcare focus. And I think we need to see more colleges that are under-resourced saying, all right, we're going to put all our chips on the table on this thing that we think, A, the market wants, and B, society needs, and see if there are takers. Because if we keep doing exactly what we're doing, we're gonna not be here in 10 years. And the other thing is you gotta make it less costly. All of the public policy prescriptions for higher education are about price. They're about who pays. So when people talk about free college, there is no free college. Free college means someone else pays. Loan forgiveness means someone else pays. So whether you agree or disagree with those policies, they don't get at the root problem, which is cost, not price. And so colleges, they have to rely more on technology. I'm not saying human contact is unimportant. It is deeply important. But the plain truth is that if you're delivering a lecture to 50 students, you could probably be just as effective using technology to deliver that lecture to 500 or 5,000. And colleges have been very, very slow to take advantage of technology, which means you can reach more people with fewer people and lower your cost. I say this in the book. It's not fun to say, but it's the truth. The job, and it's true of healthcare and it's true of higher education. The job of healthcare is not to provide as many jobs for healthcare providers as possible. It's to provide for individual and public health. The job of higher education is not to provide as many jobs for faculty and staff as possible. It's to educate people. And if we can do that with fewer people at a lower cost and still be really effective, what's the argument against that? And so that's where we need to get to, because if we keep going on the path that we're on, then I fear that what we're going to end up with is places like Notre Dame becoming the Lexus of higher education, something that's available to a small and privileged few, and everybody else dealing with very low cost, very low quality online institutions, which would not be a great outcome.
I have other questions. I wish I could get to them, but I think we're at time. So I'm going to wrap up and thank you very much, Brian, for being here with us, for your candor, and for the message that you're sharing across universities. Really a pleasure to have you. Thank you. All right, for those of you that are here, Brian will be here and available until at least 1:30, so feel free to come up and chat with him. And thank you.